Hello there. Tonight's story begins not with battle cries or burning ships, but with an apple, a golden one, thrown into a wedding and rolled straight into legend. We're drifting into a world where gods walk beside mortals, where kings are bound by oaths, and where a single decision can set the course for 10 years of war. It's not the Greece of Polish temples and philosophers. Not yet. This is the mythic age, older and stranger, when heroes had longer shadows and the gods still meddled with every step. If stories like this help you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely helps you breathe a little slower. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Somehow it's always comforting to know we're all drifting through these old tales together. So get comfortable, let the past unfold slowly, and let's begin with the moment the Trojan War was set in motion. Let us begin not with bloodshed, but with a party, a grand one at that. The kind of divine wedding that demands golden goblets, celestial harpists, and the sort of banquet where mortals are most definitely not invited. The setting is somewhere between the heavens and the wine-dark sea. The marriage of Pallas, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph of surpassing beauty and uncertain temperament. One day, she's calming the waves. The next, she's turning into a fire-breathing lioness. You know how it is with sea nymphs. Slippery in every sense of the word. Now, this was not your average wedding. The gods themselves were in attendance. Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, even Dionysus, who no doubt came for the wine in Staville's drama. You see, it had been prophesied that Thetis's child would one day outshine his father. Naturally, the gods, being the divine equivalent of power-hungry middle managers, decided that none of them fancied raising a demigod who might overthrow them. So they married her off to a mortal instead. The lucky man, Pallas, a respectable, enough for warrior, who probably didn't ask too many questions. Now here is where our story begins to turn from celebration to catastrophe. You see, someone was not invited to the wedding. That someone was Eris, goddess of strife, discord, and all things inconvenient. Think of her as the divine embodiment of a poorly timed group text. Snubbed and seething, Eris did what anyone in her position might do. She showed up anyway and brought a gift, a golden apple, shining and lovely, with 3 little words carved into its surface to the fairest. She tossed it into the hall, watched the room grow quiet, and likely walked away with a satisfied smirk. The gods, one might think, would be above petty squabbles over a shiny piece of fruit. But no, dignity fled the building faster than Hermes on market day. 3 goddesses laid claim to the apple. Hera, queen of Olympus, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and complicating everything. Each one believed herself the rightful recipient, and each was in her own way terrifying enough to make the others second-guess it. Faced with this celestial beauty contest, the gods did what many bureaucracies do when confronted with a no-win scenario. They passed the problem to someone else. Enter Paris, Prince of Troy, a man whose later decisions would suggest that judgment was not his strong suit. But at this moment he was a shepherd on Mount Ida. Having been quietly removed from royal life due to a prophecy that he would one day cause the destruction of Troy, naturally his family decided to abandon him as a child, just in case. Still, he grew up handsome and healthy, and more importantly, utterly unprepared to referee a divine pageant. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris, not in mortal modesty, mind you, but in full divine radiance. Each offered him a bribe. Hera promised power, kingship, over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle. But Aphrodite, always knowing her audience, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, thinking like a young man and not a geopolitical strategist, handed the apple to Aphrodite. And thus, the world began to burn. Now, who exactly was this most beautiful woman in the world? Her name was Helen, Queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Liada, or possibly Nemesis, depending on which version you read. She had been courted by many Greek kings, all of whom had once nearly come to blows over her. To avoid conflict, her mortal father, King Tindros, had made all the suitors swear an oath that they would respect Helen's choice, and if anyone ever took her away, they would all band together to bring her back. An early example of what you might call a foreign policy nightmare, waiting to happen. Helen eventually chose Medusa, a capable if somewhat humorless king of Sparta. They were married, and for a time things were peaceful. That is, until Paris showed up at court under the pretense of diplomacy, and then with Aphrodite's encouragement either seduced or abducted Helen. It rather depends on the source. In Homer's Iliad, Helen seems weary, regretful and passive. In Euripides' version, she's more assertive. Later, poets go further, claiming Helen never even went to Troy, just a phantom version, while the real one sat out the war in Egypt like a mildly annoyed chess piece. Whichever version you choose, the result is the same. Paris sails back to Troy with Helen and Menas enraged calls in every king, prince and warrior who once pledged an oath to protect her. And this is where myth begins to collide with history. Scholars have long debated whether the Trojan War actually happened. Was there a real conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and a city on the coast of Anatolia, one perhaps called Wusa, a name that bears uncanny resemblance to Ilium, another name for Troy? Archaeological digs at Hisarlik, the presumed site of Troy, reveal a city that was destroyed not once but several times by fire and war. Trade routes passed through this region, riches flowed, conflicts surely followed, so while gods may not have hurled spears from Olympus, someone likely hurled something over those walls. And now back to myth, the Greeks began to assemble. Agamemnon, king of Myne and brother to Menas, took charge, not because he was particularly loved, he wasn't, but because he had the ships, the swords, and a rather loud voice. Other kings answered the call: Odysseus, the clever one; Nestor, the talkative one; Ajax, the strong and silent type. And most famously, Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the very couple whose wedding had started this mess in the first place. Achilles was a prince of fear, raised by a centaur named Chiron, as you do, and trained to be the greatest warrior of his age. His mother, fearing he would die young, dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable everywhere except the heel by which she held him. This, of course, gives us the term Achilles' heel, and reminds us that even the mightiest have their soft spots, sometimes quite literally, but not all heroes were eager to join the war. Odysseus, ever the tactician, feigned madness to avoid leaving his young son. He yoked an ox and a donkey to a plough and began sowing salt into his fields until a clever Greek placed his infant son in front of the plough. Odysseus swerved, proving he was sane, and was promptly dragged off to war. Achilles, too, was hidden, disguised as a girl among the daughters of king-like comedies. This plan lasted until Odysseus came bearing trinkets and weapons, laying them out before the maidens. Achilles naturally went straight for the sword. Boys will be boys, even when wearing a dress. So the ships assembled, 1,000 of them, legend says, and the winds were ready, or were they? At the port of Auli, the fleet was beamed. The gods, you see, were not so easily manipulated. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, had been offended, likely by Agamemnon, who either boasted of his skill or killed a sacred deer. As a result, she demanded a price, the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia. This is one of those moments where Greek myth takes a very sharp turn, from pageantry to tragedy. Agamemnon hesitated, understandably so, but in the end, ambition won out over love. Iphigenia was lured to Ois under the promise of marriage to Achilles, and there she was sacrificed. Some versions offer a gentler ending. Artemis whisked her away at the last moment and left a deer in her place, but most tell it straight. Agamemnon killed his daughter, and the winds began to blow. It was a grim start to a grim war, and so with divine grudges simmering, oaths invoked, and personal tragedies mounting, the 1,000 ships set sail for Troy, not knowing they would remain there for 10 years, the cost of their pride and vengeance, and certainly not knowing that by the time it ended, nearly all of them would be dead, disgraced, or eternally wandering. But that, dear listener, is a tale for the next chapter. For now, rest easy, for even the greatest war in myth began not with a sword, but with a wedding, an insult, and a single apple. Let us turn now from the divine chaos of golden apples and goddesses to the woman who would, according to some, launch 1,000 ships. That may be a bit of an exaggeration. Poets have never been known for restraint, but it's fair to say that Helen of Sparta, later of Troy, was at the very heart of the storm. Helen's story begins before she was even born, which is always a worrying sign. Her mother later was Queen of Sparta. One afternoon, Zeus, that most persistent of Olympians, spotted her from the heavens and decided, as he often did, to seduce her. But rather than appear as himself, divine, radiant, occasionally wielding thunder, he chose instead to transform into a swan, because of course he did. The result of this peculiar encounter was, depending on the version, either an egg or several, yes, later laid eggs. Myths, as you'll find, are very particular about the strange and not terribly interested in the plausible. From these eggs hatched Helen, and sometimes also her brothers Castor and Pollux, and her sister Clynestra, who will later become very important when things begin to unravel back in Greece. But for now, Helen was raised in royal luxury. She was from the beginning a marvel. Not just beautiful, her beauty, we're told, was divinely beautiful. The kind that made men sigh, women whisper, and kings behave very badly. Now, as Helen came of age, she was pursued by just about every eligible man in the Hellenic world. Her suitors included the finest warriors, princes, and kings, including Odysseus, Ajax, and Menelaus. There were so many that her mortal father, Tyndareus, rightly feared that whoever he chose, the others would almost certainly take offense, start a war, and probably ruin the hedge on the way out. So, on the advice of Odysseus, ever the strategist, Tyndareus made the shooters swear a binding oath, the oath of Tyndareus. They would all agree to honor Helen's choice and, more importantly, to protect the chosen husband should anyone ever try to take her from him. A clever solution, and one destined, as clever solutions often are in Greek myth, to backfire spectacularly. Helen chose Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon and future king of Sparta. Now, Menelaus was competent, wealthy, respected, not particularly charming, but not easily ignored, the kind of man who polishes his own armor and expects you to notice. Helen and Menelaus were married, and for a time all was well. They had a daughter, Hermione, settled in the Spartan palace, and reigned peacefully over a well-ordered kingdom. And then Paris arrived. Paris, son of Priam and Hecuba of Troy, had been raised not as a prince, but as a humble shepherd. A common trick in myth when someone's birth is accompanied by a troubling prophecy. In Paris's case, that the prophecy was specific and rather ominous. He would cause the downfall of Troy. So naturally, his parents did what any responsible monarchs would do. They abandoned him in the wilderness. Unfortunately, Paris survived. Raised among shepherds, he grew into a man of striking beauty and very little foresight. He was eventually welcomed back into the royal family, prophecy presumably forgotten in the excitement. Not long after, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Greece, officially to establish friendly relations, unofficially to stir up the plot. When Paris arrived in Sparta, Menelaus welcomed him warmly, a gracious host by Greek standards, which usually meant offering food, wine, and not stabbing anyone. But then Menelaus was called away to attend a funeral. Paris, ever the opportunist and heavily influenced by Aphrodite, who had promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, took advantage of the king's absence. Whether Helen was a willing accomplice or a victim of divine manipulation is one of the great ambiguities of ancient myth. Homer's Iliad presents her as conflicted, ashamed, reflective, but not clearly coerced. Later tragedians, such as Euripides, give her more agency or none at all, depending on the tone. Some versions, like the Helen of Euripides, go so far as to say she never went to Troy. That Paris stole only a phantom image while the real Helen remained in Egypt, as confused as anyone. but the popular version holds that Helen went with Paris, sailing across the Aegean to Troy and leaving behind her husband, her child, and more importantly the oath that bound all her former suitors. When Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his honor publicly shredded, he did not mourn in silence. He invoked the oath. Across Greece, messengers were sent, kings were summoned, old alliances reawakened. Even those who had long since moved on were now bound by a sacred promise. And what a collection of heroes it was! Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, assumed command. He was ambitious, proud, and not above sacrificing his daughter when the wind refused to blow. But that's a tale we touched on earlier. Odysseus tried to stay out of it. He had a young son, a clever wife, and no interest in foreign entanglements. So he pretended to be mad, ploughing his fields with salt. But when Greek agents placed his infant son Tmicus in front of the plough, Odysseus swerved, proving his sanity and sealing his fate. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, was also reluctant. His mother, Thetis, had hidden him away on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of king-like comedies. Why? Because it was foretold that if Achilles went to war, he would not return. But again Odysseus came up with a solution. He laid out gifts for the girls: combs, bracelets, mirrors, and one sword. Achilles chose weapon. Predictable but effective. In time, a vast army gathered, ships were prepared. Legend says, 1,000 ships. And the greatest force the Greek world had ever known assembled under Agamemnon's banner. Before they sailed, however, they needed a good omen. You see, the Greeks took signs very seriously. The gods didn't send text messages, but they did send birds. At Ois, a serpent appeared and devoured 9 sparrows before turning to stone. The seer Calchas declared this meant the war would last 9 years and Troy would fall in the 10th. One imagines morale dipped slightly. Even so, the Greeks launched their expedition, but they didn't find Troy immediately. First, they accidentally attacked Tithania, a city that rather unfortunately looked quite a bit like Troy. Geography, it turns out, was not the Greek strong suit. Eventually they reached Troy and established a camp along the shores outside the city's mighty walls. These walls, according to myth, had been built by Apollo and Poseidon in disguise when they were briefly punished to serve King Laomedon. So they were, to put it mildly, sturdy. This would not be a quick war. Inside Troy, Helen was received not as a prisoner, but as a queen. Priam, the aged king, treated her kindly. His son, Hector, the city's greatest warrior, was polite, if somewhat disapproving. The city, for all its splendor, had become a cage. Helen was now the face of a conflict she had little control over, ripped and blamed in equal measure. The war, meanwhile, settled into a long and grinding stalemate. Raids, skirmishes, and embassies followed. Heroes rose and fell. And through it all, Helen remained at the center, not fighting, but watching. Her story is one of paradox. She is both victim and agent, loved and hated, remembered not for her deeds but for her presence, her role as the prize over which the greatest warriors bled and perished. And what of Helen herself? Well, the myths offer no simple answers. Some say she came to love Paris, then hated him. Some say she pied Menelaus, then despised him. In one version, when Troy falls, she returns to Sparta with her husband, who forgives her. In another, she is strangled by Minos' mother in a fit of righteous fury. The poets could never quite decide what to do with her. She was too beautiful to be evil, too dangerous to be good. She was perhaps the embodiment of the war itself, not rational, not fair, but entirely inevitable. And thus, with Helen in Troy, Menelaus in fury, and every king in Greece committed to vengeance, the stage was fully set. The war had not yet begun in earnest, but the fuse had been lit. The walls of Troy still stood tall, but every god, every mortal, and every poet knew they would not stand forever. In our next chapter, we'll meet the full cast of heroes and begin the siege proper, a war of pride, prophecy, and tragedy that would shape not only myth, but the entire identity of the ancient Greek world. For now, rest, dear listener. The storm is gathering, but there is still time before the swords begin to sing. It is a strange thing preparing for a war that has not yet begun. The swords have not been drawn, the ships not yet launched, but the decisions made in these moments, the quiet ones, the stubborn ones, echo as loudly as the battle cries to come. And so we find ourselves back in Greece, where alliances are being called upon, oaths remembered with theatrical seriousness, and kings emerging from the shadows of their own ambitions. The Greeks, or more properly, the Aaans, were not one nation, but a loose collection of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own king, customs, dialects, and irritating sense of superiority. Herring them was rather like herring cats, large, armoured, arrogant cats. And yet somehow Agamemnon was the one to try. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was not the most beloved of men. He had the charisma of wet marble and the diplomatic subtlety of a battering ram. But he had ships. And in Bronze Age Greece that made all the difference. He was also the brother of Menelaus, whose wife, Helen, had just absconded with a Trojan prince or been abducted, depending on whom you asked. Either way, it was Agamemnon's duty to help, and not incidentally to increase his own power while doing so. But before we set sail, let us first meet the key players of this great war, some of the finest names ever shouted across a battlefield or penned into epic verse. There was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, cunning, sardonic, and too clever by half. He would rather be farming than fighting. When the summons came, Odysseus attempted to dodge the draft by pretending to be mad. He yoked a donkey and an ox together and began ploughing his fields with salt. Unfortunately for him, the Greeks had brought a man named Palamedes, who was even cleverer. Palamedes placed baby Telemachus, Odysseus's infant son, in front of the plough. Odysseus swerved, sanity revealed. Off to war he went, fuming all the while. Then there was Achilles, the son of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph with a gift for dramatic exits. Achilles had been raised by the wise centaur Chiron, who taught him medicine, music, hunting, and more importantly, how to kill things gracefully. Now, Thetis had received a prophecy. Her son would either live a long, quiet life and be forgotten, or die young in glory and be remembered forever. She understandably preferred the first option. So she hid Achilles on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl. It's unclear how convincingly he played the part, but he lived among the daughters of king-like comedies, perhaps hoping that history would simply forget him. History, of course, never forgets Achilles. Odysseus was sent to fetch him. Knowing that no warrior could resist the call of glory or the clink of bronze, he laid out gifts before the girls, fine robes, trinkets, and one gleaming sword. Achilles predictably reached for the sword. A trumpet was sounded, and the ruse collapsed. Achilles, now revealed, was promised honor, plunder, and everlasting fame. He accepted. He also brought with him his lifelong companion, Patroclus, who had become as vital to the war as any sword or shield. Others joined too: Ajax the Greater, son of Telamon, a towering brute of a man, strong as a bull and roughly as eloquent. Diomedes, a young king of Argos, known for his ferocity and surprising reverence for the gods. Nestor, the aged king of Chios, who spoke mostly in long-winded stories about how things had been better in his day, and who somehow made everyone listen. And Calchas, the seer, who claimed to read the will of the gods by studying the flight of birds, the livers of sacrificed animals, and one suspects, the fine art of educated guessing. Altogether they gathered their men, their ships and their supplies at the port of Alis, a windswept harbour on the eastern coast of Boeotia. It was here, legend tells us, that the Greek fleet assembled 1,000 ships, if Homer is to be believed. It is a lovely, round number and deeply impractical, but myth was never built on practicality. And then nothing happened. The ships were ready. The men were restless. The gods, however, were silent. No wind stirred the sails. The sea lay as flat as a philosopher's expression, a calm so total it felt like divine punishment. And indeed, that's exactly what it was. You see, Agamemnon had made a mistake. While out hunting, he had killed a sacred stag, an animal beloved by Artemis, goddess of the hunts, protector of maidens, and not one to take a slight quietly. As if that weren't enough, he had allegedly boasted that he was the better hunter, which one imagines was the mythological equivalent of poking a sleeping bear with a borrowed spear. So Artemis refused to let the winds blow. The ships would remain trapped at Alice unless Agamemnon made amends. And by amends, she meant sacrificing his daughter, Iphigenia. This, needless to say, did not go over well. Agamemnon hesitated. He wept. He argued. He appealed to the gods. But in the end, he agreed for the sake of the war, for the sake of honor, vengeance, and all the usual platitudes. He sent word to his wife Clytemnestra that their daughter was to be married to Achilles. A lie, of course, a fatal one. Iphigenia arrived excited, perhaps even blushing, and was led to the altar. Some stories say she was killed. Others say Artemis, in a rare act of mercy, whisked her away at the last moment and replaced her with a deer. Either way, the deed was done. The winds returned, the sails billowed, and the Greek fleet at last set out across the Aegean Sea. But their first stop was not Troy. In one of those inconvenient footnotes that history tends to skip over, they accidentally landed in Euphria, a city in Mysia, believing it to be Troy. Again, ancient navigation was more art than science. They attacked. The ruler there, Telephus, was wounded by Achilles and fled. Later, in a neat twist of irony, he was healed by Achilles, using the very spear that had pierced him. The Greeks, it seems, could be both destructive and useful, sometimes in the same breath. Eventually, the fleet reached the shores of Troy, a city on the western coast of what is now Turkey. The Trojans watched from their walls as the horizon filled with black sails, and they prepared. Let us pause here to consider what sort of city Troy might have been. The archaeological site known today as Heizelik in northwestern Turkey reveals layer upon layer of cities built and destroyed over centuries. One of these layers, Troy 6 or 7, shows signs of fire, war, and abrupt ruin. There are fortification walls, storage jars, and signs of trade with the Menian world. Whether it was the Troy of Homer, we'll never know for certain, but the echoes are there. The Trojans, too, had their heroes. Pri, the old king, wise and weary, ruled from the citadel. His wife, Hecuba, kept a close court. Their sons were many, but most famous was Hector, the defender of Troy, a prince, a husband, a father, and a man who fought not for glory but for duty. Beside him stood Aeneas, a noble warrior said to be the son of Aphrodite herself, a lineage that would one day lead, also Virgil claimed, to the founding of Rome. And of course there was Paris, whose stolen bride Helen was now a guest or prisoner in the palace. Her presence was a source of both pride and tension. Some saw her as the rightful queen. Others saw her as the cause of the coming disaster. And so as the Greek ships landed and the beach was fortified, both sides prepared for war, not knowing that it would last 10 years, that it would claim the lives of almost every hero present, and that it would change the shape of mythology forever. But that is the nature of war in the ancient world. It begins not with battle cries, but with whispers, with broken promises, divine grudges, and the slow gathering of storm clouds. The Greeks had assembled, the winds had turned, the gods were watching. And somewhere in the wings, fate, that ancient, tireless weaver, had already begun her work. By now 1,000 ships had crossed the wine-dark sea and anchored off the coast of a city destined to become legend, Troy called Elon by the Greeks. It stood proud upon the edge of the Hellespont, a glittering crossroads of east and west. To modern ears, Troy may sound like a mere myth, a place of poetry and gods and overong battles. But beneath the layers of story lies a very real city. Archaeologists believe it may have been located at Heizelik in northwestern Anatolia. Here, a great walled city once stood and fell more than once. its ruins layered like pages in a long, tragic novel. Some layers show fire, some arrowheads, some clay tablets hinting at trade, diplomacy, and war. This was a place where myth met, and now the Greeks had come to knock. As they landed on the shore, they began constructing their camp. Not a quick skirmish outpost, but a long-term beachfront operation. Think less glorious charge and more tent city with strong opinions. They dragged their ships onto the sand and built a palisade wall. They created a trench. They even designated zones for sleeping, cooking, and rather optimistically for celebrating victory. Achilles and his Myrmidons took the southern flank. Ajax and the men of Salamis stood guard to the north. Odysseus naturally had a clever supply route. The Greeks were not united in temperament, but they were, at least for now, united in purpose. Troy, for its part, did not panic. The city was protected by colossal walls allegedly built by Apollo and Poseidon themselves. These divine contractors, according to myth, had been briefly punished by Zeus and ordered to serve King Laomedon of Troy. They built the walls so strong, so high, that no mortal force could breach them, at least not by strength alone. And within those walls lived the Trojans, who were not the villains that later Greek propaganda might suggest. King Priam, now elderly, ruled with surprising dignity, given the circumstances. His court was filled with sons, daughters, and advisors. His wife, Hecuba, was sharp and formidable, and quite frankly more perceptive than most of the warriors outside the gates. The jewel of Troy's defense was Hector, firstborn son of Priam and Hecuba. He was no demigod, no half-immortal brute. He was simply a man, but a man of iron loyalty, skilled arms, and noble restraint. He fought not for fame, but for his city, his family, and his little son, Astyanax, who toddled through the palace halls unaware of the deathly fate. History was already scribbling on his future. And of course, there was Paris, the younger son, less noble, more complicated. Paris had, you may recall, won Helen from the gods. He was beautiful, charming, and utterly unequipped for the fallout of his decisions. In Homer's Iliad, Paris is not evil nor cruel, just painfully aware that he's not built for battlefield glory. He's the man who started a war with a kiss, and then spent most of it dodging the consequences. As for Helen, she now lived in the upper chambers of the palace. Opinions varied. Some in Troy admired her grace, her refinement, her almost supernatural beauty. Others, more practical, less bewitched, blamed her for the war. One imagined she heard the whispers in the Iliad. She is both self-aware and self-loathing. "Would that I had died before I followed your son here," she says to Pri. And yet she remains. The war began. Not with the toppling of towers, but with raids. The Greeks, unable to breach the walls, resorted to attacking Trojan allies, towns along the coast, seizing supplies, enslaving women, and burning what they could not carry. It was this pattern, campaign, retreat, rest, that defined the first 9 years of the war. During one such raid, the Greeks captured 2 women whose names would later ignite disaster. One was Chrysis, daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo. She was given to Agamemnon. The other was Prius, awarded to Achilles. They were not spoils in the sense of war trophies. They were grimly taken as concubines. And the gods, it turns out, were watching. When Chrysis' father pleaded for her return, and Agamemnon arrogantly refused, Apollo, god of plague, archery, and occasional poetic justice, loosed a pestilence on the Greek camp. Soldiers began to die. Animals perished. The air turned foul. Eventually, Agamemnon relented, though not without flair. He returned Chrysis to her father, yes, but demanded Brissus from Achilles in compensation. This, to put it mildly, was a mistake. Achilles, already smouldering with pride, withdrew from the war. He refused to fight. He refused to speak. He even refused to look at Agamemnon unless you count glaring. The mightiest Greek warrior had now stepped back, sulking, some said, but in truth deeply wounded. In the heroic code, honor was more vital than armor. To be shamed in public was not merely insulting, it was souls-shattering. The Greek morale faltered. They pushed against the city, but without Achilles, they found themselves pressed thin. Hector, on the other hand, surged forward, rallying the Trojan troops and driving the Greeks back toward their ships. Skirmishes flared, chariots thundered, shields cracked, and still the walls of Troy held. But let us step back for a moment and consider what this war looked like, not in poetry, but in Bronze Age terms. This was not trench warfare, nor massed armies of uniformed soldiers. It was chariots, short swords, and thrown spears. Bronze, not iron, armor was heavy and personal. Battles were small and often duels between champions observed by spectators. Think rugby with more stabbing. War was also a ritual. Before fighting, warriors made speeches, sometimes to their enemies, boasting of lineage, exploits, and divine favor. Afterwards, they stripped the dead of armor and weapons, which were both valuable and symbolic. And yet, amid the stylized duels and epic speeches, there was also real loss. Entire towns destroyed, sons who never returned, women enslaved. The songs remember the heroes, but the silence belonged to the nameless dead. The Iliad, which covers only a few weeks in the 10th year, offers us a window into this moment of stalemate and sorrow. It's during this time that we meet the full cast of characters. Ajax the Greater, wielding a massive shield like a moving wall. Diomedes, who wounds even Ares in battle. Nestor, the elder statesman, offering advice so long-winded that it likely outlasted some battles. And of course the gods. Ah yes, the gods. They were not neutral observers. They took sides, bickering, scheming, sometimes even joining the fray. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon favored the Greeks. Apollo, Aphrodite, and Ares sided with the Trojans. Zeus, nominally neutral, mostly tried to keep order and failed spectacularly. The gods bickered as much as the mortals did, one might even say more so. They threw divine tantrums, manipulated fates, and occasionally disguised themselves as ordinary soldiers just to meddle. Truly, the Olympians were the first micromanagers. Meanwhile, on the ground, the war slogged on. The Greeks, growing desperate without Achilles, attempted diplomacy. They sent an embassy to his tent. Odysseus, Phoenix, and Ajax came with offers of treasure, apologies, and even the return of Breeze. But Achilles, brooding in his tent, refused, not out of petulance, but principle. His honor had been trampled, and in the world of heroic warriors, honor was life. Still, even Achilles could not ignore what came next. Hector, bold and commanding, led the Trojans in a major offensive. He pushed the Greeks back to their ships. Fires began to spread. It looked for a moment as if Troy might win, not with cunning or strength, but with sheer persistence. This is the moment the war turned inward. The moment the greatest heroes of both sides stood at the brink, not yet colliding, but fully revealed. For now, the Greeks dug in, the Trojans pressed forward, and Helen watched from the walls, her fate and everyone else's still unwritten. The siege had begun. The walls stood tall, but something deeper had begun to crumble. Trust, pride, and the thin threads binding kings to kings. And so the 10th year dawned, with Achilles silent, Agamemnon humbled, and Hector rising. In our next chapter, the cracks will deepen. The war which so far has simmered will begin to boil. But for now, rest easy, dear listener. The ships are still anchored, the fires still smoke, and the gods for the moment have not yet drawn their final lots. When people imagine the Trojan War, they often picture a continuous roar of battle, swords flashing, heroes shouting, gods hurling thunderbolts from the sky. But the truth, if such a thing exists in mythology, is a little less cinematic and a great deal more slow. Because for 9 long years, this war dragged on in the kind of grim, grinding fashion that would have tried the patience of even the most enthusiastic poet. A siege not of constant combat, but of attrition, raids, hunger, sickness, and the occasional divine tantrum. And perhaps that is why the Trojan War endures, not simply because of the final blow, the horse, the fire, the fall, but because it reflects something very human. A grand idea that once in motion, no one can quite stop. a war waged out of honor that slowly becomes anything but. Let's return to the beach. The Greeks had built a camp along the shoreline, sprawling like a market left out too long in the sun. Their ships were drawn up and fortified behind a wall of stakes and trenches. They had everything they needed for a short war, which meant naturally that they were unprepared for a long one. Troy's mighty walls held firm, and the Trojans rarely ventured beyond them. Every attempt to storm the city ended in blood and frustration, and so, for most of those 9 years, the Greeks did what they could. They raided the surrounding countryside. They sacked towns loyal to Troy, seized food, livestock, gold, and most tragically, women. These women were taken as concubines, slaves, bargaining chips. The war, for all its heroic verses, was also brutally transactional. And this is how Briseis and Chrysis entered the story. 2 women, caught in the tide of war, handed to men as rewards, and ultimately used to ignite the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, which we touched on before. But the cracks ran deeper than one quarrel. Beneath the polished speeches and bronze breastplates, the Greek coalition was starting to unravel. Agamemnon's leadership, while militarily sound, was unpopular. He had a knack for taking more than his share of spoils and offering less than his share of credit. Kings like Odysseus, Diomedes, and Ajax often found themselves balancing obedience with their own ambitions and growing irritation. Achilles, for his part, had withdrawn from the war entirely. His pride wounded, his honor insulted. He refused to fight. He spent much of these years in his tent, sharpening his weapons, practicing the lyre, and generally being a brooding icon of Bronze Age masculinity. Meanwhile, the Trojans were not idle. While the Greeks tore through the countryside, the Trojans formed new alliances. Reinforcements arrived from neighboring kingdoms, Lycians, Phryans, and others whose names have been lost to time. Among these was a warrior named Sarpedon, son of Zeus, who fought with a quiet dignity that would later inspire even his enemies. Inside Troy, tensions simmered. The people suffered. Food grew scarce. Supplies from the interior were cut off by Greek patrols, and yet the walls held, a symbol of endurance against overwhelming odds. As the war dragged on, both sides began to rely more heavily on divine favor, or at least the illusion of it. The Greeks sacrificed to Athena, Ha, and Poseidon. The Trojans looked to Apollo, Aphrodite, and Artemis. The gods, it must be said, behaved much like the mortals, bickering, sulking, playing favorites, and occasionally stomping onto the battlefield in disguise. There's a story told in hushed tones by later poets of a duel between Menas and Paris early in the war. The idea was simple: settle it man to man, one duel, one outcome, fewer funerals. The duel was mumsubstol, arranged. Menelaus, understandably angry, fought with a ferocity born of righteous fury. Paris, less heroic and more fashionable, was swiftly overwhelmed. As Menelaus prepared to finish him off, Aphrodite intervened, snatching Paris from the battlefield and placing him back in his chamber with Helen, who was at this point growing increasingly tired of this sort of nonsense. It's worth noting that Aphrodite did not ask anyone's permission. She simply decided, rather like an indulgent parent, that her favorite son had suffered enough. Minos, meanwhile, stood in the dust, sword still raised, wondering what on earth just happened. The war, it seemed, would not be decided by honor. There were moments of glory, to be sure. One of the brightest stars of this middle period was Diomedes, king of Argos, who fought with such relentless precision that even the gods noticed. At one point, Diomedes, assisted by Athena, who temporarily gave him the ability to see gods on the battlefield, wounded Aphrodite herself. Yes, a mortal man cut the flesh of a goddess. It was frankly an embarrassing moment for her. She fled to Olympus, bloodied and wailing, and Zeus gently suggested that perhaps war was not the best arena for someone whose chief weapon was a love charm. Later, Diomedes even wounded Ares, the god of war. Ares, in turn, did what all warriors fear most. He complained to his father. Zeus, unimpressed, told him to stop being dramatic and get back to it. These episodes, while entertaining, tell us something deeper. The war had become so tangled, so stretched, that the divine and mortal realms had begun to blur. The gods were not distant, silent observers. They were quite literally in the thick of it, sulking, scheming, bleeding. Yet even as heroes fell and cities burned, the war refused to end. Like a bad dinner guest, it lingered past its welcome. Back in the Greek camp, Achilles remained absent from the battlefield, a decision that continued to cost the Greeks dearly. Without him, morale dipped. Hector led increasingly bold attacks. Greek casualties mounted. Even Odysseus found it harder to keep the ranks focused, though he did his best. Sometimes with cleverness, sometimes with wine. It was in the atmosphere of decay and distrust that betrayal took root. You may recall Palamedes, the clever man who exposed Odysseus's fake madness at the start of the war. Well, Odysseus, ever the long-game player, never forgot. According to later tales, Odysseus framed Palamedes as a traitor, forging a letter and planting gold to suggest he was accepting bribes from the Trojans. The Greeks, perhaps too eager for a scapegoat, executed him just like that. One of the finest minds among them gone is a moment that illustrates the war's true cost. Not just lives, but trust. Not just cities, but virtue. The longer it went on, the more it demanded. Not just heroes, but their humanity. And the Greeks, once bound by a noble oath, began to splinter further. Agamemnon's arrogance grated. Achilles' silence loomed. Even Nesta's endless stories started to sound less like wisdom and more like noise. And what of Helen? She still watched from the walls. Her beauty, undiminished by time, had become a symbol, a kind of living banner. For the Greeks, she represented what had been stolen. For the Trojans, what they refused to surrender. And, for Helen herself, she was trapped between myth and memory, between love and loathing. In the Iliad, she speaks of her own regret, calling herself a dog, a term of shame, and wondering whether she is cursed. One might wonder if she, more than anyone, saw the war for what it truly was. Not a story of glory, but a slow, unspooling tragedy. And so the 9th year came to a close. The Greeks, exhausted and divided, still held the beach. The Trojans, battered and isolated, still held the city. The gods, nursing wounds, both physical and prideful, still meddled where they pleased. And Achilles, he still sat in his tent, silent, furious, refusing to yield. Not to Agamemnon, not to the war, not even to fate, but something had begun to shift. For in the camp a young man named Patroclus watched the fires burn. And soon, very soon, that fire would spread. If war had a heartbeat, it would not be the clash of bronze or the thrum of chariot wheels. It would be the breath held between action and consequence, the silence before something truly terrible happens. And so we arrive at the heart of the Iliad. Not the start of the Trojan War, nor its end, but a singular stretch of days in the 10th year, when one man's pride would alter everything. His name, of course, is Achilles, son of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph with a firm grasp on fate. Achilles was raised with the knowledge that he was different and doomed. It was said he had 2 paths before him: a long life without glory, or a short one that would echo through the ages. He chose the echo. But no one tells you that glory is rarely glorious while you're living it. It is more often lonely, infuriating, and filled with people who don't understand you. At the start of this chapter, Achilles is not fighting. His quarrel with Agamemnon over the slave girl Brice has driven him into a sulk so legendary it fills the first book of Homer's Iliad. But to call it a sulk is to miss the depth of it. Achilles is not simply pouting, he has been publicly humiliated. In a warrior society where honor is as valuable as life, Agamemnon has taken both. You see, when Agamemnon gave up Chrysos to stop a plague sent by Apollo, he decided to take Briseis from Achilles as compensation. as if trading women were a form of morale management. In doing so, he violated the unspoken code among heroes. A man's prize, however grimly acquired, was his dignity. Agamemnon might as well have taken Achilles' shield and spat on it. Achilles responded not with violence, which was surprising, but with withdrawal. He retreated to his tent, refused to fight, refused even to speak to Agamemnon. And as he sat brooding, the war outside began to turn. Without Achilles, the Trojans surged. Hector, noble and dutiful, led charge after charge. The Greeks, caught between poor leadership and divine meddling, began to lose ground. Skirmishes turned into roots. Even the mighty Ajax found himself forced to retreat. At one point, the Trojans reached the Greek ships, the very beachhead the Aeaeans had held for nearly a decade. Achilles watched and did nothing. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the Iliad, that its greatest hero's defining action is inaction. For pages he sits, stewing, not because he lacks courage, but because he refuses to give Agamemnon the satisfaction of his return. You might say it's a lesson in how dangerous pride becomes when mixed with principle, or perhaps how easily the gods unravel the best of men. Meanwhile, Agamemnon, in rare form, began to panic. Realizing belatedly that alienating the best warrior among them had consequences, he offered a ransom. Treasure, horses, cities, even the return of Briseis, untouched, as if Achilles should now be grateful. He even swore an oath, and Agamemnon rarely swore, unless it was to himself in the mirror. The embassy sent to deliver this apology was a who's who of persuasive Greeks. Odysseus, always the silver tongue, Ajax, always the strong arm, and Phoenix Achilles, old tutor, sent in the hopes that paternal guilt might succeed where politics failed. And so they entered Achilles' tent. There they found the hero plucking softly at a lyre, not preparing for war, but playing music, a reminder, perhaps, that warriors too have inner lives. They made their case. Glory, honor, the needs of Greece. And Achilles said no, but not with fury, with quiet conviction. He spoke of the futility of war, of Agamemnon's insults, of how no amount of gold could redeem lost pride. He even questioned the heroic code itself. Why should he die for a man who scorns him? Why should glory come at the price of his life? It's here that Achilles becomes more than just a warrior. He becomes a question. What is heroism worth if it means suffering fools? What is victory if you lose yourself to get there? And so he refused. The embassy returned empty-handed, and the war grew bloodier. With the Greek camp nearly in flames and the Trojans emboldened, Petrus stepped forward. Ah, yes. Peut-être, friend, companion, brother in arms. Some say. More than that, in Homer's world, the precise nature of their relationship is less important than the emotional weight of it. Patroclus was Achilles' heart outside his body, and he could no longer bear to watch the Greeks die. He begged Achilles, "Let me fight in your place. Let me wear your armor. Let the Trojans think you've returned. Maybe they'll fall back." Achilles agreed. But with one condition, only drive them away from the ships. Do not chase them to the gates. Patroclus donned the armor, gleaming, god-forged, unmistakably Achilles, and led the Myrmidons into battle. It worked. The Trojans, believing Achilles had returned, panicked. Patroclus fought with skill, fury, and more than a little recklessness. He killed warrior after warrior, including Sarpedon, son of Zeus, causing such grief that even the gods debated whether to intervene. But Patroclus, swept up in the moment, forgot his promise. He drove the Trojans all the way back to the walls of Troy. And there Hector met him. The two clashed. Spear against sword, prince against hero. And in the end, Hector killed Patroclus, not knowing who he truly was, until the helmet fell away. The death of Patroclus was a shock. not just to Achilles, but to the Greeks, to the Trojans, to the gods. But no one felt it like Achilles. When he heard, he collapsed in grief. He wept. He tore his hair. He covered himself in ash. He lay in the dust. His pride, his refusal, his rage, all of it turned inward, and then it turned outward. The wrath of Achilles had begun. It would be beautiful, it would be terrible, and it would not be stopped. First he sought new armor, his old set now worn by the fallen Petetoire. Thetis, his mother, rose from the sea and went to Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, who forged for Achilles a new suit of armor. Bronze so fine it glowed, a shield so vast it depicted the entire cosmos. It was not just armor, it was fate, worn as fashion. Then Achilles rejoined the battle. The Greeks, seeing him return, roared with hope. The Trojans, seeing him return, trembled. The gods watched, some in awe, some in horror. Because they knew when Achilles was angry, he was not a man. He was a storm. He cut through the Trojan lines like fire through straw. He fought not for glory, but for grief. Not for Agamemnon, but for Petetoire. He drove the Trojans back to the walls of the city, slaughtering all in his path. He fought the river god Scamander, who tried to drown him in anger at the piles of corpses choking his waters. Even the gods had to drag Achilles from the flood. And at last he met Hector. We will speak of that duel in the next chapter, for it deserves a moment of its own. But for now, let us return to the tent of Achilles. Where once he had brooded in silence, he now paced in fury. His hands, once still, now itched for retribution. His heart, once proud, now burned with sorrow. The rage of Achilles was not just about war. It was about the unbearable weight of loss, the helplessness of watching someone you love die, and realizing it was in part your fault. He had withdrawn from battle to prove a point, but now that point had cut too deep. Achilles had rejoined the war, but it was no longer a campaign for honor or pride. It was a funeral in motion. There are moments in myth when the war falls away, when the spears and the horses and the shouting crowds dissolve and we are left only with silence. And in that silence, something ancient and human stirs: grief. This is one of those moments. The war is still raging. The Greeks are still dying. The Trojans are still defending their city. But all of it, for the briefest time, becomes a backdrop to one man's sorrow. Achilles has just lost Petetoire. To many, Petroa was merely a companion, his second in command, his trusted friend. But to Achilles he was much more: a tether, a conscience, a reminder that life was more than blood and bronze. Their bond was deep, forged not only in war but in laughter, memory, and those quiet hours when no one is watching. Some say they were lovers, others say brothers in spirit. But what the texts agree on, what Homer sings without ambiguity, is that Achilles loved Patroclus more than anyone else in the world. And when that love was taken from him, so too was everything that held Achilles together. Let us begin with the death itself. Patroclus had donned Achilles' armor, led the Myrmidons into battle, and pushed the Trojans back from the Greek ships. For a moment, it worked. The Trojans thought Achilles had returned. Panic rippled through their lines, but Patroclus, emboldened by success, forgot the warning Achilles had given him. Do not go to the gates. He went anyway, and there, beneath the towering walls of Troy, he was struck. First by Euphorbus, then by the hand of fate, and finally by Hector, Prince of Troy, the killing blow. Hector stripped the famous armor from Petetoi's body, still unaware of his identity, and declared victory. But then, dying on the ground, Patroclus spoke. He told Hector that Achilles would come, that his death would not end this, it would only begin it. And so it did. Back at the Greek camp, Achilles was waiting, still withdrawn, still bitter, still refusing to fight. And then the news came. The accounts vary on who told him. In some it was Antilochus, son of Nestor, panting with grief. In others it was a chorus of survivors, but the result was the same. Achilles collapsed. He fell to the ground, heaped dust upon his head, and screamed. It was the cry of a man, not wounded in the flesh but in the soul, the kind of howl that shakes, not just tents, but gods. His mother Thetis rose from the sea. She knew even before he spoke, and he told her, "I must return to the war. I must kill Hector. I must avenge Patroclus, even if it means my own death." For Achilles now understood something terrible. His fate was sealed. The choice he'd once had, long life or short glory, was no longer his. Patroclus was dead, and there was only one road left. But he could not walk it just yet. First, he had to bury his friend. The Greeks retrieved Patroclus' body, not without difficulty. Hector and the Trojans, hungry for the armor and the reputation, tried to claim it. But Ajax and Menelaus, among others, fought them off. Achilles himself appeared on the battlefield, unarmored, roaring so loudly that the Trojans recoiled in fear. His presence alone turned the tide. Then Thetis, ever the beautiful mother, went to her Phaestus, the smith of the gods. There in a furnace of divine flame was forged new armor, brighter, stronger, more terrible than before. The centerpiece was a shield so finely wrought it contained the whole of the world. Cities at peace and war, farmers in the field, lovers dancing, stars turning overhead. It was a reminder even to Achilles that there was more to life than vengeance. But he wore it anyway. And then came the funeral. In Homer culture, burial rites were sacred. To die without proper ceremony was to wander the underworld in misery. Achilles vowed not just a burial, but an honoring. They built a pea vast and solemn. Sacrifices were made, including gruesomely 12 Trojan captives Achilles slew in Patroclus' name. Whether this was grief or rage is difficult to say, but it was dark and deeply telling. There were games too, chariot races, boxing, javelin. These weren't distractions, they were acts of remembrance. For the Greeks, excellence in sport was a way of touching the divine. Even in death, Patroclus would be surrounded by honor. Then came the moment Achilles placed a lock of his hair in Patroclus' hand. A small gesture, a devastating one. He whispered promises, and the pea was lit. Smoke curled into the sky, rising like a soul. And somewhere in that long twilight between myth and memory, Patroclus passed into legend. But Achilles did not find peace. He found fury. He turned his gaze to the walls of Troy, to Hector. Now, to be fair, Hector did not kill Patroclus out of malice. He was defending his city. He had no idea at first who was inside the armor, but such subtleties do not survive grief. And so Achilles rejoined the war. He moved like fire. He killed without pause. He hunted Trojans like animals. He defied the gods, even Xanthus, the river god of Troy, who begged him to stop clogging his waters with corpses. Achilles refused, and when the river rose up in wrath, attempting to drown him, it took the intervention of Hera, Athena, and Hestus, wielding flame against flood, to drag Achilles out. Even the gods could barely contain him. And then at last Hector and Achilles met. This was no skirmish, no random clash on a bloody field. This was a duel foretold, long in coming and deeply personal. Hector had waited outside the gates, knowing this moment must come. He stood not just for Troy, but for every man who fights because he must, not because he desires it. When Achilles arrived, Hector's courage wavered. He ran. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy, Achilles pursuing Hector, fleeing, until finally Athena, disguised as Hector's brother, tricked him into standing his ground. The 2 warriors faced one another, and the fight was swift. Achilles killed Hector, driving a spear into his neck. But death was not enough. In one of the most brutal acts of Homeric poetry, Achilles tied Hector's body by the ankles to his chariot and dragged it through the dust around the walls, not once, but over and over. It was a violation, a desecration. A man of Hector's nobility deserved better. But Achilles was beyond mercy. He dragged the body back to camp, threw it beside Petetro's pea, and left it to rot. For days the Greeks were silent, even the gods were troubled. Then something miraculous happened. King Priam, aged, grieving, and unarmed, snuck into the Greek camp, guided by Hermes himself, and entered Achilles' tent. There he fell to his knees, kissed the hands that killed his son, and begged, not as a king but as a father, and Achilles, moved by the rawness of it, wept. He saw Priam, and through him he saw Peleus, his own aging father. He saw his future, his fate, his loss. He lifted the old man up, gave him food, wept beside him, and then he returned Hector's body. For a moment grief gave way to grace. There was no victory parade, no song of triumph, just two men, broken by loss, holding the fragile thread of decency in their hands. And so Hector was buried properly, mourned by his wife Andromache, his mother Hecuba, and Helen, who called him gentle, one of the few men in Troy who had never blamed her. As for Achilles, his end was near. He knew it, but he had done what he set out to do. He had avenged Patroclus. He had met his fate. He had become, for better or worse, immortal. When stories pass through time, some moments become weightier than others. Not because they're louder, but because something essential shifts within them, something irreversible. And so we come to the duel, the one that echoed across 1,000 Amphilles poems and generations, Achilles versus Hector. But this isn't just a tale of strength meeting strength, it's the story of what happens when grief turns into rage, when a hero forgets why he fights, and then for a moment remembers. Let us begin where we left off. Patroclus is dead, his body desecrated. His armor, once the dazzling gift of the gods, now worn by his killer, Hector, prince of Troy and Achilles. That great tower of ruff and pride has come undone. He refuses food, refuses comfort. He lashes out not only at the Greeks, but at the very framework of the heroic world. What good is honor, he asks, if it's paid for with someone else's life? The gods apparently are still accepting sacrifices in pride. But Achilles is not done, not yet. His mother Thetis emerges from the sea. She sees her son's pain and understands with the clarity of the divine that his time is ending. She goes to Hystus, blacksmith of the gods, and begs him for new armor. And what armor it is! The shield alone is a universe. Upon it Hephaestus forges the entire world. Cities in peace and war, weddings, harvests, constellations wheeling in the sky. It is a meditation on mortality cast in bronze, a reminder perhaps that even in a story soaked in blood, life goes on. But Achilles isn't looking for reminders, he's looking for Hector. Before that, however, he must bury Petro, and this, more than any battle, shows us who Achilles truly is. In Bronze Age burial custom, the dead were honored with pious, their bones collected and placed in urns. Great tombs were raised. To leave a body unburied was a shame, both for the soul and the living. The Mycenaeans buried their dead with grave goods, gold and weapons, believing the afterlife to be a shadowy continuation of life on earth. You packed light, but you did pack. And so Achilles prepares a funeral with all the gravity of a king laying a crown to rest. He kills 12 Trojan prisoners, offering them to Patroclus in the afterlife. A brutal gesture, a reminder that Achilles' grief is still shaped like vengeance. Even in mourning, he cannot resist drawing blood. He holds funeral games, chariot races, boxing matches, javelin throws, not distractions, but sacred rites. For the Greeks, to compete was to honor the dead. To strive in their name was a kind of immortality. Nestor offers a running commentary on every contest, of course, the Bronze Age's first sports pundit. And finally, when the fire burns low and only ashes remain, Achilles cuts his hair, once grown as a vow to the river god Spacus, and places the strands on Patetro's body. Not a warrior now, a mourner. And then he turns to Troy. Hector, meanwhile, knows what's coming. He's not a fool. He's not driven by pride or prophecy or divine whispers. He's driven by duty. As Prince of Troy, he cannot flee. He cannot hide behind the walls. Even now, as his wife Androme begs him to stay, he tightens his armor and walks out alone. The city watches. Achilles approaches like a storm, not with speeches or heralds, but with a silence heavier than drums. 3 times Hector runs around the city walls, not from cowardice, but from instinct, from the realization that this is not a man, but a fate. At last, the goddess Athena in disguise tricks Hector into standing still, promising him aid, then vanishing when it matters most. It's the sort of divine interference that would make a chess referee weep. They fight. Hector strikes, but Achilles wears armor forged by gods. Achilles strikes, and Hector falls. As he dies, Hector asks that his body be returned to his family. Achilles, consumed by wrath, says no. He lashes Hector's body to his chariot and drags it through the dust around the walls of Troy, past the weeping eyes of his parents, his wife, and even Helen, who once called Hector gentle. This desecration is not mere cruelty. It is a violation of everything sacred in Greek belief. Burial was not a privilege, it was a right. Even enemies were given their rights. But Achilles, in his grief, has broken the code. And yet we do not turn away. Because Achilles is not a monster, he is a man in pain. He has lost the one person who studied him. And without Patroclus, Achilles becomes unmed. The code of honor, so carefully observed, has collapsed under the weight of loss. For 12 days he drags Hector's body in circles. Each morning new dust, each night new shame. And yet the body preserved by Apollo does not decay. Even the gods, it seems, are unwilling to let this story rot prematurely. The gods watching grow uneasy. Even Apollo, who favored the Trojans, begs for mercy. Zeus, the high god himself, sends a message: enough. And so one final act begins. Priam, the aged king of Troy, father of 50 sons, now bereft of all but memory, sneaks into the Greek camp, not with an army, with a ransom and with hope. He enters Achilles' tent alone, kneels, and says in a voice lined with age, "I kiss the hands that killed my son." And in that moment, something breaks. Achilles looks at Priam and sees Peleus, his own father. He sees his own end. He sees a world that is not built of victory and vengeance, but of grief passed from one man to another. He weeps. He lifts Priam from the floor, offers him food, shelter, even comfort. There is a kind of holiness in the quiet between them. They eat, they speak of fathers, of children, of the things no poem quite captures, and then, without ceremony, without bargain, he returns Hector's body. The 2 men sit not as enemies, but as fathers of the dead. For a brief moment, the war stops. No trumpets, no declarations, just silence. Hector is buried. A great P is built. His wife, Andromache, mourns. His mother, Hecuba, weeps. Helen too speaks, calling him the only man in Troy who never shamed her, a reminder that even in war, kindness echoes louder than conquest. And so the defender of Troy passes into memory. And what of Achilles? He knows now that his death is coming, but for the first time it doesn't matter. He has done what needed to be done, not in battle, but in mercy. This is the transformation. Achilles began as a figure of wrath, of unstoppable pride, and here, for one breath of story, he becomes something else. Not a warrior, not a son of prophecy, but a man who has felt the shape of sorrow and chosen compassion. The tide has turned, not because the Greeks have won, but because their greatest hero has shown that war is not always victory. Sometimes it is just survival, sometimes it is letting go. Troy still stands, but the walls feel thinner now. The gods no longer shout. And Achilles, our brightest, briefest flame, is standing at the edge of his fate. The next arrow has already left the bow. By now the sands outside Troy were saturated with blood, and yet the city still stood. Heroes had come and gone. Gods had taken sides, changed their minds, and occasionally joined the fighting themselves. The greatest warrior the Greeks had ever known had returned, avenged his companion, and found briefly a fragment of peace. But the end, that distant thunder, was growing louder, and now the war prepared to take its final turn. Achilles was still in the field, still terrifying, still somehow alive, but not for long. Let us speak of his death, not because it is unexpected, but because it is, in the way of Greek myth, terribly expected. The gods, particularly Apollo, had not forgotten what Achilles had done to Hector. Apollo had watched the dragging of the body, the defiance of the burial code, the rage that had pushed beyond mortal limits. So when the time came, he lent his help to a most unlikely figure, Paris. Now Paris was not a hero. He was a lover, a charmer, a prince with good cheekbones and poor decision-making. But with Apollo's guidance he took up a bow. And when Achilles, blazing with victory, drew too close to the Scan gates, Paris let the arrow fly. Some say it struck him in the heel, the one place Thetis had failed to protect when he dipped him in the Styx. Others say it was the hand of the god that made the arrow fatal. Either way, the effect was the same. Achilles fell. There are no grand speeches, no slow-motion farewells, just the collapse of a man who had burned too brightly for too long. The Greeks mourned and then predictably argued who would inherit Achilles' armor. It was the finest in the world, forged by Histus, gleaming with divine artistry. Two men came forward, Ajax the Greater, son of Telamon, strong, blunt, and fiercely loyal, and Odysseus, son of Laertes, clever as a god and twice as persuasive. A contest was held. The Greeks listened to speeches. Ajax spoke of deeds. Odysseus spoke of strategy, and in the end, the armor went to the man who could make words into weapons. Odysseus. Ajax was shattered. He had fought bravely, carried Achilles' body from the field, stood firm when others wavered, and now he was passed over for a silver-tongued tactician. His honor, so long bound to his strength, unraveled. In the dark of night, Ajax went mad. He slaughtered sheep, believing them his enemies. When his senses returned, and he saw what he had done, he took his own life by his own sword, alone. So ended another hero, not in battle, but in despair. The Greeks burned his body quietly. Even now suicide was a complicated matter, honor and shame forever intertwined. And still Troy stood. At this point, the war had become a tragic theatre. Each hero fell in turn. The gods had begun to withdraw, embarrassed perhaps by what they had helped create. The Greeks turned to prophecy. Always a last resort, when all else fails. According to the seers, 3 conditions had to be met for Troy to fall. First, the son of Achilles must fight at Troy. Second, the Greeks must retrieve the bow of Heracles. Third, the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena, must be taken from Troy. Simple, really. So they set out to find Achilles' son, Neoarmus, also known as Pius. Raised far from the war, he was young, untested, and full of the kind of aggressive confidence only teenagers possess. When Odysseus fetched him, he agreed, not out of duty, but out of destiny. He would finish what his father had started. Next came Philites. Now, Philites was a sore subject. Years earlier, he had been bitten by a snake en route to Troy, and the wound had festered. The Greeks, never known for their bedside manner, abandoned him on the island of Lemnos. With him, they left the bow of Heracles, the only weapon prophesied to bring down Troy. Charming, Odysseus returned, full of apologies. Philaites was understandably furious, but after some persuasion and the promise of a hero's redemption, he agreed. The bow returned to the war. The prophecy piece by piece began to align. The third task fell to stealth. The Palladium, a statue of Athena, protected Troy. So long as it stood, the city could not fall. Odysseus and Diomedes crept into Troy by night, scaled the walls and stole it. No flash, no flourish, just two men doing what armies could not, and now, finally, Troy was vulnerable. But it was still not beaten. And so came the trick. The Greeks, led by Odysseus, built a wooden horse, a massive thing hollow inside, carved to appear as an offering to Athena. They left it at the gates of Troy and sailed away, or so it seemed. The Trojans found it, confused, curious, and debating. Some, like Laocoon, warned against it. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he said, before being rather dramatically eaten by sea serpents. The gods were not subtle. Others, like Sun, a Greek left behind, pretending to be a deserter, spun a tale of sacrifice, of atonement, of war's end. The horse, he claimed, would bless Troy, and the Trojans, tired and hopeful, pulled it inside. What followed was a long night of revelry. After 10 years of siege, the Trojans finally had something to celebrate. Fires were lit, wine was poured, songs were sung, and the people of Troy, weary but joyful, believed the war was over. But the war, as wars tend to do, had one last act. At night, the Greeks returned. From the horse, warriors emerged: Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and others. They opened the gates. The Greek army, hidden on a nearby island, stormed the city. The chaos was immediate. Temples burned, families fled. The clang of bronze echoed through the narrow streets. Priam, the old king, was cut down at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus himself. An act that even in the blood-soaked economy of war was considered monstrous. Hecuba, his queen, was taken as a slave. Andromache, Hector's widow, saw her child Astyanax hurled from the walls, a cold calculation to prevent vengeance from the next generation. Helen was reclaimed by Minos, though not without tension. Some say he lifted his sword and she simply dropped her robe. Old habits. But what of the victors? They had won, yes. But what did they win? The city lay in ruins. The treasures of Troy were loaded onto ships. The gods, once so involved, had gone quiet. And the Greeks, those who survived, began the long, uncertain journey home. Odysseus would wander 10 more years. Agamemnon would return to a wife plotting his murder. Menelaus would meander through Egypt before making it back to Sparta. The war had ended, but the stories had only begun. Victory in Greek myth is never clean. There is always a cost, a stain, a reckoning. And the horse, it remained, not as a relic, but as a symbol, a reminder that in the end, it wasn't strength that ended Troy. It was a story, one of deception, of cleverness, of the long game played by a man who could lie to a goddess and get away with it. If Achilles represented the peak of heroic wrath, Odysseus embodied cunning. The Greeks called it matis, not just cleverness, but strategic wisdom, the kind that hides a blade behind a smile, the kind that ends wars not with a roar, but a whisper. And so with fire licking the rooftops and history closing its book, the Trojan War came to an end. The cost was ruin, the reward songs sung across centuries of rage, of love, of cities burned and legends born. And the war, though ended, would echo on in Ithaca, in Rome, in every tale where pride meets fate, and cleverness topples kingdoms. But that's another story. The war was over, and yet the war was not over. Troy had fallen, its walls once thought impregnable, had crumbled under the weight of deceit and fire. The streets were choked with ash and sorrow. The bodies of princes and paupers lay alike beneath the burning timbers of palaces. The air wrire of smoke, of blood, of the end of something vast. But for those who survived, Greeks and Trojans alike, the hardest part had